The West Texas
Bazaar
wind
làm
does
việc như
not
vậy,
merely
vừa
blow,
đến
it
mua súng,
scrapes. It
bà già
carries
mà
a
biết dùng
fine
súng
red
thì còn nên
grit
chọn
that
súng ngắn.
etches
Đúng
itself
rồi.
into the grain of old barns, strips the paint from tractor hoods, and carves deep permanent lines into the faces of the people who choose
Keep
to
your
live
grip
in its
firm,
path.
elbows bent.
Like
Beatrice
this?
Alden
Perfect.
knew
Now,
that
align your
wind
sights.
Got
intimately.
it.
She had lived out here on this sprawling, silent plot of land for longer than the Blacktop Highway had existed a few miles down the ridge. At 72 years old, Beatrice was a woman sculpted from the landscape itself. She was tall, though her shoulders carried a slight, imperceptible forward lean, the kind of posture that comes from decades of bearing weight that others could not see, and from spending thousands of hours hunched over the cyclic and collective controls of a military aircraft. Her hair was a shock of striking silver pulled back and tied into a practical, unyielding knot at the base of her neck. It was a no-nonsense style designed to stay out of the eyes, designed to fit beneath a flight helmet, though it had been years since she had worn one. But it was her hands that truly told her story. They were hands that had been broken, stitched, and healed. They were intensely calloused, deeply scarred, and mapped with thick blue veins. They did not look like the hands of a typical grandmother baking pies for a Sunday social. They looked like they had been forged from old iron and weathered rope. They were the hands of a woman who had demanded absolute unflinching physical control from heavy machinery in the most unforgiving environments on Earth. For the past 3 years, the ranch had been entirely hers. It was a profound, echoing kind of quiet that settled over the property. Her husband Arthur had passed away quietly in the front room overlooking the eastern bluffs. Arthur had been a quiet man, a structural engineer who loved the slow pace of the plains. Since his passing, Beatrice kept the routine alive. She kept the barbed wire fences mended, walking the perimeter with heavy leather gloves and a pair of fencing pliers. She kept the engine of the old, faded blue Ford pickup turning over, changing the oil herself in the dirt driveway. She drank her coffee, black on the wooden porch, at exactly 0500 hours every single morning, watching the sun drag itself over the horizon, painting the dry scrub brush in violent shades of blood and brass. It was a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life she had earned the hard way. But lately, the quiet of the county had been shattered. It started a little over a month ago. A string of home invasions had begun to plague the county. They were not random acts of desperation by local teenagers. They were highly coordinated, ruthlessly efficient, and chillingly specific. 3 properties had been hit in the span of 6 weeks. The perpetrators were deliberately targeting the isolated ranches, the places sitting at the end of long dirt roads, where the porch lights were the only illumination for 5 miles in any direction, and where the response time for the county sheriff was measured in fractions of an hour, not minutes. More importantly, they were targeting the elderly. Just 2 nights prior, a mere mile and a half down the dirt road from Beatrice's property, the pattern had repeated itself. The thieves had struck the home of Dorothy Higgins, a 74-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived alone with a golden retriever. They had cut the power at the exterior breaker box, bypassed the old rusted deadbolts on the back door with professional ease, and slipped into the home under the cover of a moonless night. Dorothy had woken up to the sound of floorboards creaking. She had opened her eyes to find a masked figure standing directly over her bed holding a heavy Maglite flashlight. She had screamed a raw, terrified sound that echoed off the walls of her empty house. The intruders had fled, taking whatever loose cash, jewelry, and silver they could grab in a 3-minute window. But the true damage was already done. The sheer paralyzing shock of the event had triggered a severe cardiac episode. Dorothy was currently lying in the intensive care unit at the county hospital, hooked up to a myriad of monitors, her sense of safety permanently destroyed. Beatrice had heard the news at the local diner the following morning. She had been sitting at her usual booth in the back, eating a plate of eggs and black toast, when the county sheriff walked in and shared the grim details with the waitress. The diner had erupted into hushed, anxious whispers. The older patrons looked at their coffee cups with wide-eyed, frightened eyes. They talked about buying brighter floodlights. They talked about getting bigger dogs. They talked about moving into town where the streetlights were bright and the neighbors were close. Beatrice had not spoken a single word. She had simply listened. She took a slow sip of her black coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down her throat. She set the heavy ceramic mug down on the Formica table, left a $5 bill beside her plate, and walked out into the bright, blinding Texas morning. Beatrice Alden did not do panic. She did not do fear. In her world, fear was simply an emotional, useless response to a lack of preparation. Fear was what happened when you allowed the enemy to dictate the terms of the engagement. Beatrice only did preparation. When she returned to her ranch that afternoon, she had walked directly into her bedroom. She opened the heavy steel door of her floor safe and pulled out her late husband's revolver, a beautiful, well-maintained Smith & Wesson Point .357 Magnum. She popped the cylinder, checked the chambers, and felt the weight of the wood grip in her palm. It was a devastating piece of machinery, but it was a six-shot revolver. It was heavy, the double-action trigger pull was long and unforgiving, and the recoil was brutal on arthritic wrists. If three men kicked in her back door at 2 in the morning, 6 rounds, and a heavy recoil might not be enough. She needed something modern. She needed a striker-fired semi-automatic 9mm. She needed higher capacity, faster target acquisition, and a weapon she could operate seamlessly in the pitch black of a hallway. The next morning, the sky above the plains was the color of bruised slate, threatening a dry storm that would never deliver rain. Beatrice dressed with her usual Stark utility. She pulled on a pair of heavy denim jeans, lacing up her scuffed leather work boots with precise tight knots. She slipped her arms into her faded olive drab canvas jacket, a piece of clothing she had owned for 20 years, the elbows worn thin and soft. Finally, she pressed a plain, unstructured khaki ball cap down over her silver hair, the brim casting a deep shadow over her pale blue eyes. She walked out the front door, locking the deadbolt behind her, and climbed into the cab of the old Ford. The vinyl bench seat creaked under her weight. She pumped the gas pedal twice, turned the key, and the heavy V8 engine roared to life. It settled into a steady, rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat, vibrating through the steering column and into her calloused hands. She shifted the column shifter into drive, the transmission clunking solidly into gear, and began the long drive toward town. The road was empty. The tires crunched over the gravel before hitting the smooth blacktop of the county highway. Beatrice drove with both hands on the wheel, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the terrain. It was an involuntary reflex. Even now, 30 years after she had last worn a uniform, her brain was wired to look for landing zones, to assess wind direction from the sway of the prairie grass, to identify choke points and elevated vantage points. You can take the pilot out of the combat zone, but you can never ever take the combat zone out of the pilot. Her destination was a square, windowless cinder block building sitting on the industrial edge of the county line. A large, illuminated sign above the reinforced steel door glowed red in the overcast morning light. It read Lone Star Munitions. It was a well-known establishment in these parts. It was the kind of place that had been outfitting local ranchers, hunters, and weekend sport shooters for 2 decades. It had a reputation for carrying high-end inventory, but also for employing a specific breed of young, aggressive clerks who viewed themselves as tactical operators despite never having served a day in uniform. Beatrice pulled her truck into the expansive gravel lot. She parked in the back corner, away from the entrance. Always leave an unobstructed path for egress. She killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening. She sat there for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel, gathering her focus. She opened the door and stepped out into the biting wind. The gravel crunched loudly under her heavy boots. She walked toward the entrance with a measured, deliberate stride. Her posture was completely upright. Her chin was level. She reached out and pulled the heavy steel handle of the front door. The hinges were well-oiled, opening smoothly. Above the threshold, a small brass bell jingled sharply, a bright, metallic, almost cheerful sound that cut harshly through the low, buzzing hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Beatrice stepped inside. The interior of Lone Star Munitions hit her senses like a physical wave. The air was thick with the sharp chemical scent of Hops No. 9 solvent, the metallic tang of brass casings, the heavy smell of gun oil, and the dry, dusty odor of old cardboard ammunition boxes. It was a sensory environment Beatrice knew intimately, a smell that transported her back to armories in places far hotter and far more dangerous than West Texas. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling. Mounted deer heads with massive antlers stared down with dead, glassy eyes presiding over the space. The floor was polished concrete, clean and cold. Running down the center of the room were long, illuminated glass display counters, packed edge to edge, with hundreds of handguns, gleaming steel revolvers, matte black polymer semi-automatics, subcompacts, and heavy-duty duty weapons. Along the back wall, heavy iron racks held tight, disciplined rows of rifles and shotguns, standing at attention like a silent infantry line. Beatrice stepped just inside the threshold and stopped. She let the heavy steel door swing shut behind her. She did not wander aimlessly down the aisles. She did not immediately approach the counter. She stood perfectly still, letting her eyes adjust to the harsh artificial light. Her gaze swept the room in a smooth, calculated, continuous arc. It was an old habit, an instinct burned into her neural pathways. Assess the exits. There was the front door and a heavy fire door at the rear, marked with a glowing red sign. Assess the sightlines. The center aisles were clear, but the tall racks of camouflage clothing near the register created a massive blind spot. Assess the occupants. There were 3 people working the floor that morning. 3 young men. The first was standing behind the primary handgun display. His name tag read Brody. He looked to be about 24 years old. He was leaning heavily against the glass, his posture sloppy and relaxed. He was wearing a tight-fitting coyote tan tactical vest over an olive drab t-shirt. The vest was covered in an excessive amount of MOLLE webbing and useless pouches that held nothing of value. He sported a thick, immaculately groomed beard that he clearly spent more time maintaining than he did cleaning his weapons. A drop-leg holster was strapped to his right thigh holding a custom Glock, but the retention hood was flipped down. Next to him was a slightly older man, perhaps 26. His name tag read Wyatt. Wyatt was actively gesturing with his hands, speaking loudly and passionately as he debated the ballistic coefficient and terminal ballistics of a new rifle round. He spoke with the rapid, breathless, overly technical cadence of someone who had spent his entire adult life watching military combat footage and weapon review videos on YouTube, but who had never once felt the concussive, bone-rattling shockwave of a real detonation. Behind the main cash register stood the youngest of the 3. His name tag read Hayes. He was barely 21. He was supposed to be pricing heavy boxes of shotgun shells, but instead he was slouched over the counter, his spine curved, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his smartphone, completely oblivious to his surroundings. The owner of the shop, a man Beatrice knew only by reputation as a serious, no-nonsense businessman, was nowhere to be seen. The boys were running the asylum. Brody was the first to notice her standing silently by the door. He stopped mid-sentence. He slowly turned his head, his eyes scanning Beatrice from the ground up. He looked at her scuffed boots. He looked at her faded canvas jacket. He looked at the plain ball cap. He elbowed Wyatt hard in the ribs. Brody tilted his head toward Beatrice, a slow, arrogant smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He muttered something under his breath, keeping his voice just low enough to be indistinguishable. Wyatt looked over, his eyes narrowing slightly before he let out a short, nasal snort of laughter. Beatrice ignored them. She did not require their approval, and she certainly did not care about their amusement. She walked toward the main glass counter. Her footsteps were light, entirely silent on the concrete floor. She moved with an economy of motion, wasting no energy. She reached the counter, stopped, and reached up to pull the plain ball cap from her head. She revealed the stark, brilliant silver of her hair. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the glass counter, her scarred knuckles resting against the cold surface. "Good morning," Beatrice said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a specific dense gravity. It was low, remarkably calm, and carried a steady, resonant frequency that instantly commanded the acoustic space around it. It was a voice accustomed to speaking over the roar of twin turboshaft engines. Brody pushed himself off the back counter. He sauntered over to her side of the display, walking with an exaggerated rolling gait. He stopped directly across from her. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at her gray hair. He looked at the deep wrinkles around her mouth and the loose skin at her throat. Then his eyes dropped to her hands resting on the glass. He saw the thick joints, the calluses, the slight tremor of age. "Help you with something?" Brody asked, his tone flat, bored, and dripping with thinly veiled condescension. "I am looking for a home defense firearm," Beatrice stated clearly. "Specifically a reliable striker, fired 9mm. Something compact. A weapon I can safely and easily secure in a biometric lockbox beside the bed, but deploy rapidly if needed." Brody let out a long, theatrical sigh, puffing his cheeks out as if he had just been asked to perform manual labor in the hot sun. He leaned his forearms on the glass counter, invading her personal space slightly, and looked her up and down once more. "Home defense," Brody repeated. He let the words roll around in his mouth like they were a joke he was saving for the perfect punchline. He exchanged a deeply patronizing, knowing glance with Wyatt, who had stepped up beside him. It was the look of a young man who believed with every fiber of his being that the world belonged entirely to the swift, the young, the aggressive, and the loud. It was the arrogance of untested youth. "You sure about that?" Brody asked, a cruel smile touching his lips. "You sure you're not looking for a walking cane with a built-in flashlight, ma'am? I think they sell those down at the pharmacy on Main Street." Wyatt chuckled loudly from the end of the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. Behind the register, Hayes finally looked it up from his smartphone, a wide, eager grin spreading across his face as he realized a performance was happening. Beatrice did not blink. She did not shift her weight from one foot to the other. She did not cross her arms defensively. Her expression remained as completely unreadable, solid, and unforgiving as a slab of Texas granite. I am sure, she said quietly. Brody rolled his eyes to the ceiling. All right, fine. Home defense for Grandma. He reached beneath the glass counter, taking a key from his belt and unlocking the sliding wooden door. He reached in and pulled out a sleek, modern, subcompact 9mm pistol. He checked the chamber with a lazy, practiced flick of his wrist, then slapped the weapon down onto the rubber protective mat on top of the glass display. He immediately launched into a rapid-fire, breathless monologue. He aggressively rattled off factory specifications, trigger pull weights, sight radius dimensions, and magazine capacities. He used heavy tactical jargon, talking about bore axis, slide serrations, and muzzle flip. He was speaking far too fast, intentionally blurring the information. He was not trying to educate a customer. He was trying to overwhelm her. He was performing for his friends. He was using his specialized knowledge as a weapon to make the old woman feel small, incompetent, and completely out of her depth in his domain. Beatrice listened to the noise. She filtered out the arrogance, ignored the jargon, and focused her eyes solely on the weapon resting on the mat. It was a good piece of machinery. Solid polymer frame, aggressive grip, stippling, good night sights. She reached out with her right hand to examine the firearm. She wanted to check the weight, feel the balance in her palm, and test the resistance of the slide. Just as her calloused fingers brushed the textured polymer grip, Brody swiftly and aggressively pulled the weapon back across the rubber mat, sliding it completely out of her reach. Whoa, easy there, Grandma, Brody said, his voice raising in pitch, dripping with exaggerated mocking concern. Let's make sure you can actually hold it steady first before you go waving it around. We don't want any accidents. He turned his back to her, looking directly at Wyatt, the cruel grin, now a wide, toothy smile. Hey, Wyatt, Brody called out, projecting his voice so it echoed off the cinder block walls. You think they make one of these with a vibration alert? You know, just so she doesn't forget it's in her hand when her arthritis acts up. The laughter erupted. It was loud, harsh, and incredibly mean. Wyatt bent over, slapping his thigh. From behind the cash register, Hayes decided he needed to join the pack. He wanted to belong. He put his phone face down on the counter and leaned forward. Honestly, ma'am, Hayes chimed in, his voice cracking slightly with amusement. With all these break-ins happening, a gun is just a liability for someone your age. You might be better off just getting one of those medical alert buttons. Brody barked a loud, sharp laugh, slamming his hand flat against the glass counter. Yeah, that's it. You know the ones? Brody mocked suddenly, hunching his shoulders and imitating a trembling, frail, terrified old woman. He pitched his voice high and shaky. Help, help, I've fallen, and I can't find my Glock. The three young men howled. They threw their heads back and laughed. They reveled in their perceived superiority. They stood in their clean tactical gear, surrounded by lethal weapons they had only ever fired at paper silhouettes on sunny, peaceful Saturday afternoons, and they laughed directly in the face of a 72-year-old widow who just wanted to protect her home. Beatrice stood completely motionless. She looked at Brody. She shifted her gaze to Wyatt. She looked at Hayes. There was no anger in her pale blue-brown eyes. Anger is a hot emotion. It makes people careless. There was no flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck or reddening her cheeks. There was absolutely no visible hurt. To be hurt requires valuing the opinion of the person inflicting the insult. Beatrice valued these boys less than the dirt on the floorboards of her truck. Instead, there was something else in her gaze, something devastatingly quiet, cold, and incredibly level. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness. It was the look of a seasoned combat veteran watching arrogant children play with matches near an open powder keg. It was the look of someone who understood exactly how fragile human life was, staring at boys who thought they were invincible. But the boys in the shop were far too inexperienced, far too sheltered to read the temperature of the room. They mistook her profound silence for weakness. They mistook her stillness for submission. They thought they had won. When their laughter finally began to subside, dying down into a series of self-satisfied chuckles, Beatrice spoke. Is there someone else I could speak to? She asked politely. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it possessed a cutting edge that sliced through their lingering amusement with surgical precision. Brody wiped a tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. He sniffed, adjusting his tactical vest, and shrugged his shoulders heavily. The owner's not here right now, Brody said, waving his hand dismissively toward the front door, gesturing for her to leave. He's out doing inventory runs. You're stuck with us, lady. So if you don't want the gun, I suggest you head on down to the pharmacy. Beatrice looked at him. She looked at his unsnapped holster. She looked at his relaxed posture. She held his gaze for one long, suspended second. Then she nodded slowly, just once. She did not turn around and walk out the front door in a huff. She did not raise her voice to demand respect. She did not ask for a manager's phone number. She did not threaten to leave a bad review on the internet. Instead, she turned away from the counter entirely. She walked across the polished concrete floor, heading toward the large reinforced front window overlooking the parking lot. Tucked against the wall beneath a rack of Target silhouettes was a small black metal folding chair. Beatrice gripped the back of the chair, pulled it out, and unfolded it with a sharp metallic clack that echoed in the quiet room. She sat down, her back straight against the metal rest. She reached into the deep zippered inside pocket of her canvas jacket. Her fingers bypassed the small canister of pepper spray and retrieved a small, worn leather notebook. The leather was darkened with years of sweat oil and exposure to the elements. It had traveled to continents these boys couldn't find on a map. She reached into her breast pocket and produced a solid steel tactical pen. She uncapped it with a quiet, authoritative click. She flipped the leather cover of the notebook open, revealing a pad of waterproof, grid-lined paper. She rested the notebook on her knee, uncapped the pen, and began to write. Behind the main counter, the three employees exchanged confused, mocking glances. This was not the reaction they had anticipated. Brody rolled his eyes in exaggerated disbelief. He lifted his hand to the side of his head, pointing his index finger at his temple and making a rapid spinning gesture, signaling to Wyatt and Hayes that the old woman was completely crazy. Senile. Lost her mind. They scoffed collectively. They turned their backs on her, leaning over the counter, and went back to their loud, pointless conversations about muzzle velocity, body armor plating, and what they would do in a hypothetical firefight. They entirely dismissed her from their reality. She was a non-threat, a ghost in the corner. But Beatrice Alden was not writing a letter to customer service. She was not writing a diary entry about her hurt feelings or a grocery list. She was doing what she had been trained by the United States military to do. She was doing what had kept her and her crew alive in the most hostile, unforgiving combat zones on the face of the earth. She was assessing the battlefield. Her steel pen moved across the grid-lined paper in sharp, precise, immaculate block letters. Item 1, security camera placement. The primary camera above the front entrance was angled roughly 3 degrees too high. It was meant to capture faces, but the angle created a massive unmonitored blind spot directly beneath the transom, large enough for a grown man to crouch in unseen. Item 2, inventory security. The secondary glass counter holding the high-caliber armor-piercing ammunition was completely unsecured. The sliding lock mechanism was broken, the metal latch hanging loosely from the track. A child could slide it open. Item 3, perimeter breach. The heavy steel door leading to the back alley inventory and receiving room had been propped open with a wooden wedge. Presumably, the boys wanted to let a breeze in. Tactically, it was an open invitation to the street. Anyone could walk into the back room, secure a weapon, and flank the main floor before the alarm ever sounded. Item 4, personnel readiness. 3 unobservant, overconfident males. 0 situational awareness. Their focus was entirely inward. Their weapons were holstered, but their retention straps were unsnapped for comfort. Their body language was relaxed to the point of lethargy. If a genuine threat like the men who had broken into Dorothy's house walked through that front door right now, these 3 boys would be dead before their hands ever touched their grips. They were not operators. They were liabilities. She documented it all. She mapped the geometry of the room in her mind, drawing the intersecting lines of fire, noting the points of solid cover versus mere concealment, and cataloging the fatal vulnerabilities of the shop. The wind howled outside, a low moaning sound that rattled the large front window pane beside her. Beatrice simply turned the page in her notebook, quiet and immovable as a mountain. She did not mind waiting. Beatrice Alden was a woman who understood patience intimately. She understood that arrogance was loud, fast, and ultimately brittle, but consequence was always silent, slow, and devastatingly permanent. She sat in the metal folding chair. The steel pen scratched methodically against the paper. The boys laughed and bragged behind the counter, and the minutes ticked by on the clock above the door. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. 38 minutes passed in the Lone Star Munitions shop. She sat, she observed, and she waited for the owners to arrive. The passage of time inside Lone Star Munitions was measured not by the clock on the wall, but by the relentless scratching sound of a steel pen moving across grid-lined paper. Beatrice Alden sat in the metal folding chair near the front window, her posture perfectly vertical, her breathing slow and controlled. She was an island of absolute discipline in a sea of youthful ignorance. Behind the heavy glass displays, Brody, Wyatt, and Hayes continued their loud, hollow banter, oblivious to the tactical dissection happening just 30 feet away. They talked about stopping power. They talked about urban combat scenarios. They talked like boys who had learned about war from a television screen. Outside, the West Texas wind continued to hurl fine red dirt against the reinforced glass. And then cutting through the low howl of the wind came the deep, rhythmic, unmistakable rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine. A black three-quarter-ton pickup truck pulled into the gravel lot, the heavy suspension absorbing the ruts with a muted thud. The truck was clean but deeply scratched, a working vehicle that had seen its share of rough country. It parked directly in front of the main entrance, precise and perfectly centered in the lines. The engine was cut. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and the man who stepped out into the biting wind was Garrison Ridge. Garrison was 51 years old. He was built like a cinder block wall with broad, heavy shoulders, a thick neck, and a posture that was permanently locked into a state of coiled readiness. His hair was cropped close to the scalp, salted heavily with gray, and his face was mapped with the kind of deep, permanent lines that only come from years spent squinting into the desert sun. Before he had opened Lone Star Munitions, Garrison had spent 20 years in the United States Army, the majority of it serving in the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. He had been deployed to combat zones across 3 different continents. He ran his gun shop with the exact same merciless discipline, strict accountability, and zero tolerance for nonsense that he had used to run his Ranger squads. Garrison reached into the bed of the truck, his thick forearms flexing as he hauled out a heavy wooden crate of surplus ammunition. It weighed nearly 70 pounds, but he carried it under one arm with practiced ease. In his other hand, he held a stack of shipping manifests. He kicked the truck door shut with a heavy work boot and walked toward the entrance of the shop. He pushed the front door open, the brass bell jingling above him. The moment Garrison stepped over the threshold, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. The temperatures seemed to drop. Behind the counter, Brody immediately stood up straighter, wiping the arrogant smirk off his face. Wyatt stopped talking mid-sentence, his hands dropping to his sides. Hayes scrambled to shove his smartphone into his pocket and grabbed a pricing gun, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a box of 12-gauge shells. They all knew the rules. Garrison did not tolerate idle hands, and he certainly did not tolerate the kind of loud, unprofessional behavior they had been displaying for the past 40 minutes. Garrison did not even look at them. His eyes, trained by decades of clearing hostile structures, immediately swept the room the second the door closed behind him. It was an automatic reflex. Clear the corners. Check the sight lines. Identify the occupants. He was about to bark an order at Brody to come help him carry the rest of the crates from the truck. He had the words formed in his mouth, but as his gaze swept past the large front window, it locked onto the small metal folding chair tucked in the corner. He saw the faded olive drab canvas jacket. He saw the plain khaki ball cap resting on the windowsill. He saw the striking silver hair pulled tightly back. And then he saw the posture. It was a posture he had not seen in over 2 decades, but it was burned into his memory with the permanence of a branding iron. It was the posture of command. Garrison stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy wooden crate of surplus ammunition slipped from beneath his muscular arm. It hit the polished concrete floor with a massive echoing thud, the wood splintering slightly at the corner, the brass casings inside clattering violently against each other. The shipping manifest fluttered from his other hand, scattering across the floor like dead leaves. Behind the counter, Brody jumped at the sudden noise. Wyatt's eyes went wide. They had never seen their boss drop anything. They had never seen him lose his ironclad grip on his surroundings. Garrison's face went entirely blank. The blood drained from his cheeks. Every ounce of the hardened, tough guy exterior vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. It was not anger, it was not confusion. It was the look of a man who had suddenly, unexpectedly, come face to face with a ghost. He was completely recalibrated like a compass needle, violently snapping to find true north. Brody, entirely misreading the situation as usual, took a step forward and tried to speak. "Hey, Garrison." Brody started, his voice a little too loud, trying to cover his previous laziness. "This old woman came in earlier, wanting a 9mm, but I don't think she knows what she's—" Garrison raised his right hand. He did not look at Brody. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the woman sitting in the folding chair. But the gesture was so sharp, so violently commanding, that Brody's mouth snapped shut instantly, his teeth clicking together. The entire store went dead quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the wind rattling the glass. Garrison Ridge took a deep breath. He squared his broad shoulders. He stepped over the spilled shipping manifests and walked toward the corner of the room. He did not walk like a shop owner greeting a customer. He walked with a stride that was unmistakably, undeniably military. His back straightened until his spine was rigid. His chin lifted. His arms fell precisely to his sides, the fingers curling naturally inward. He reached the folding chair, stopping exactly 2 paces away. He drew his large frame to full rigorous attention. His heels snapped together. He looked down at the woman with the silver hair, his eyes shining with something the 3 young employees had never ever seen from their hardened boss. Raw, unguarded emotion. "Major Alden," Garrison said. His voice was thick, vibrating with a mixture of profound reverence and absolute disbelief. "Ma'am, it is an absolute honor." Beatrice looked up from her grid-lined notebook. She looked at the towering, muscular man standing rigidly before her. The deep lines around her eyes softened just a fraction. A faint, tired but genuine smile crossed her weathered face. "At ease, Sergeant Ridge," Beatrice said quietly, her voice smooth and steady. "I'm just here to buy a pistol." But Garrison Ridge did not move. He did not relax his shoulders. He stood there at rigid attention for 5 full seconds, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes glassy. Behind the main glass counter, Brody Wyatt and Hayes looked at each other in sheer terror. Brody's face had gone completely white. He mouthed the word "Major" to Wyatt, his eyes wide and panicked. The realization of what they had just done, of who they had just mocked, was beginning to dawn on them like a creeping frost. Garrison finally relaxed his posture, but only slightly, transitioning into a parade rest. He reached out, grabbed a heavy wooden stool from nearby, and pulled it over. He sat down directly across from Beatrice, leaning his massive frame forward, resting his thick elbows on his knees. He spoke quietly, his tone low and resonant, but the store was so utterly silent that every single word carried perfectly across the room, bouncing off the cinder block walls. "Boys," Garrison said. He did not turn around to look at his employees. He kept his eyes locked on Beatrice. "Do you have any idea who this woman is?" None of them spoke. The silence from behind the counter was absolute. Hayes gripped the edge of the cash register so hard his knuckles turned white, looking like he was praying the concrete floor would open up and swallow him whole. Garrison nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "This is Major Beatrice Alden, United States Army retired," Garrison said, his voice echoing with heavy authority. "She was a rotary wing aviator. She flew UH-60 Blackhawks for the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers." He paused, letting the weight of that elite unit designation settle into the room. Even the boys behind the counter knew what the 161st was. They were the absolute best of the best, the pilots who flew the most dangerous, highly classified missions in the darkest corners of the globe. "In October of 1993, Garrison continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming gritty and distant, "during the Battle of Mogadishu. I was an 18-year-old Ranger private. I was a kid. I was scared, I was stupid, and I was deployed to a city that had suddenly turned into hell on earth." Beatrice raised her scarred, veined hand gently from her notebook. "Garrison, you don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am, I absolutely do," Garrison replied instantly, his voice cracking with emotion. Garrison finally turned his head, looking over his shoulder at the 3 pale faces staring back at him from behind the glass display. His eyes were no longer glassy. They were hard cold and burning with a fierce protective fire. "On the second afternoon of the battle," Garrison said, projecting his voice so it hit the boys like a physical blow, "my chalk got pinned down in a 3-story concrete building near the Bakara Market. The city was a complete kill zone. The streets were flooded with militia. Every single exfiltration route was hopelessly compromised. We were cut off. We were running out of ammunition. We had 3 men critically wounded, bleeding out on a dirty concrete floor. We called for an immediate medevac." Garrison stopped. He swallowed hard, his throat working. He looked down at his own massive scarred hands. "Command came back on the radio and told us it was too hot," Garrison said softly. "They said the anti-aircraft fire was too heavy. The RPGs were filling the sky like rain. They said they couldn't risk losing another bird. They told us we had to hold our position and wait for an armored convoy that was hours away. We all knew what that meant. We knew our wounded weren't going to make it." He looked back up at his employees. "But Major Alden heard that radio call," Garrison said. "She was the pilot in command of a Black Hawk operating 3 miles outside the city. She wasn't ordered to come get us. She defied the holding pattern. She broke protocol. She dropped her bird out of the sky and flew directly into a wall of lead and fire. The gun shop was so quiet you could hear the dust settling on the glass counters. She brought that Black Hawk down into a street that was too narrow for the rotor blades." Garrison continued, his voice tight with remembered adrenaline. "She hovered that 40,000-pound aircraft 3 feet off the ground, holding it perfectly steady in the middle of a hurricane of RPG fire and heavy machine gun rounds. The noise was deafening. The bird was taking hits metal, tearing everywhere." Garrison stood up from the stool. He turned fully to face Brody, Wyatt, and Hayes. He walked slowly toward the counter, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete. While we were loading our wounded into the back of her bird, Garrison said, his voice rising, vibrating with intense, contained fury, an RPG detonated against a nearby wall. The shrapnel tore through the cockpit of the Blackhawk. A piece of jagged steel the size of a spark plug ripped directly through the Major's right shoulder. Brody swallowed audibly. Wyatt looked down at his boots. Garrison slammed his hand flat against the glass counter directly in front of Brody. The reinforced glass shuddered. Brody flinched backward. "She didn't scream," Garrison roared, the sound filling the shop. "She didn't flinch. She didn't drop the aircraft. She sat in that pilot seat, bleeding out, and she held that cyclic control stick with a grip made of iron. She held that bird perfectly level while my squad threw our dying brothers into the back. And then she flew us out of hell." Garrison paused, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He leaned over the counter, getting inches away from Brody's face. "I was sitting in the jump seat right behind her," Garrison whispered, his voice shaking with raw memory. "I could smell the smoke. I could smell the hydraulic fluid, and I could see the blood pouring down her arms, soaking her flight suit. I watched her hands. I watched those hands fight a failing hydraulic system and heavy crosswinds to get us back to the medical tents." He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at Brody's chest. "Now," Garrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper, "you tell me exactly what you said to this woman when she walked into my store today." Brody's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face was the color of old ash. He was trembling. He looked at Garrison, then looked past him to Beatrice, sitting quietly in the corner. He realized with crushing clarity what he had done. He had looked at a living legend, a woman who had bled for her country, and he had seen nothing but a weak, slow target for his own pathetic amusement. I, Brody stammered, his eyes darting wildly. Wyatt looked firmly at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Hayes looked like he was going to be physically sick. "You mocked her," Garrison stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. "A citizen walks into this establishment looking to defend her own home, and you mocked her. You made jokes about her age. You made jokes about her ability to hold a weapon. You looked at her hands, the same hands that pulled my bleeding brothers out of a combat zone 20 years ago, and you laughed at them." Garrison straightened up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the counter. "Major Alden has more trigger time, more flight time, and more combat experience than every single person in this room combined, multiplied by 10, Garrison said coldly. "She didn't just qualify on these weapons platforms. She carried them into places you wouldn't survive for 5 minutes. And you told her to go get a medical alert button." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be described, because everyone who has ever felt it knows exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like the terrifying, crushing moment you realize you have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. It sounds like the moment you realize you cannot take something back. Beatrice shifted in her chair. The sound of the metal legs scraping against the concrete broke the spell. "Garrison," Beatrice said. Her voice was calm, a stark contrast to the thick emotional tension in the room. Garrison turned away from the counter, his posture immediately softening as he faced her. "Yes, ma'am." Beatrice stood up. She did not look at the boys behind the counter. She had already moved past them. They were no longer a factor in her assessment. She walked over to Garrison, holding out the small leather notebook. "I didn't come here to get anyone fired, Garrison, and I certainly didn't come here to be thanked," Beatrice said practically. "I came here for a firearm, but while I was waiting, I took the liberty of looking around your perimeter." She tapped the open page of the notebook. "You have a serious vulnerability," Beatrice said, her tone shifting entirely to business. It was the tone of a commanding officer briefing a subordinate. "Your rear steel door, the one leading to the alley inventory room. Someone has propped it open with a wooden wedge." Garrison frowned, confused by the sudden change in topic. He took the notebook, looking down at her neat, precise handwriting. "It's an open invitation," Beatrice explained, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "We have a highly organized crew hitting isolated properties in this county. They bypass standard locks. They move quietly. If they decide they want high-end optics and subcompact firearms, that alley door is how they get in. You have thousands of dollars in tactical inventory, and you're leaving your rear flank completely exposed." Garrison read the notes. He saw the schematics she had quickly sketched of the camera blind spots. The anger he felt toward his employees was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp shock of realization. The major was right. She wasn't complaining about the customer service. She was giving him a masterclass in tactical security. He looked up from the notebook, his respect for her deepening, if such a thing were even possible. Hayes, Garrison snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. The youngest employee jumped behind the register. Yes, sir. Go to the back room right now. Kick that wedge out, deadbolt that heavy door, and verify the alarm contacts are engaged. Do not walk, run. Yes, sir, Hayes stammered, practically sprinting out from behind the counter and disappearing into the back hallway. Garrison turned his attention back to Beatrice. He closed the leather notebook reverently and handed it back to her. Thank you, Major, Garrison said softly. You just saved my ass, again. Beatrice offered a small, curt nod. She slipped the notebook back into the deep pocket of her canvas jacket. Just trying to keep the neighborhood quiet, Garrison. Now about that 9mm. Right this way, ma'am, Garrison said, gesturing toward the premium section of the display counter. He walked around the glass, physically bumping Brody out of the way. Brody stumbled back, keeping his head down, desperately wishing he were invisible. Garrison reached beneath the counter. He bypassed the standard models Brody had been handling and pulled out a matte black Pelican case from the bottom shelf. He set it heavily on the rubber mat and popped the heavy latches. Inside was a Sig Sauer P365XL chambered in 9mm. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering. It was compact enough to be easily concealed or stored in a nightstand safe, but it featured a slightly longer slide and grip module, providing exceptional balance, a higher magazine capacity, and a smooth, flat-faced trigger that broke like glass. This is the piece, Major, Garrison said, his tone entirely professional, addressing her not as a fragile customer, but as a fellow operator. It's reliable, the recoil impulse is incredibly manageable, and the X-ray 3-day/night sights are brilliant in low-light conditions. I run this exact model myself when I'm off duty. He checked the chamber, verified the weapon was clear, and locked the slide to the rear. He laid the pistol gently on the mat, the grip facing her. I also brought out a heavy-gauge steel biometric lockbox. Garrison continued, pointing to a dark gray safe on the shelf behind him. It reads your fingerprint in under a second. You keep it bolted to the floorboards next to the bed. In the dark, your hand finds it naturally. The lid springs open silently. The weapon is ready before you even sit up. Beatrice stepped up to the counter. She did not hesitate. She reached out with her scarred, calloused right hand and picked up the firearm. The movement was so fluid, so deeply ingrained in her muscle memory that it was almost beautiful to watch. Her grip was absolute. Her hand did not shake. Her index finger found the frame above the trigger guard, naturally resting exactly where it was supposed to. She brought the weapon up to eye level, her stance shifting automatically into a perfect, balanced Weaver stance. She examined the night sights, her eyes focusing sharply on the front post. With a swift, practiced motion, she depressed the slide release with her thumb. The heavy steel slide slammed forward into battery with a satisfying metallic crack. She pressed the magazine release, catching the empty magazine smoothly in her left palm, then seated it back into the grip with a firm, authoritative tap. She nodded once, lowering the weapon to a low-ready position. The familiarity and absolute competence in her movements told every single person in that room everything they needed to know. Across the store, Brody watched from the shadows near the rifle racks. He watched the way her hands moved, the same hands he had mocked just 30 minutes ago. His expression was no longer arrogant. It was a mixture of profound awe and crushing, suffocating shame. He realized he knew nothing about weapons. He only knew about toys. She knew about survival. It's a good weapon, Garrison, Beatrice said, setting the pistol back onto the rubber mat. I'll take it, and I'll take the biometric safe along with 500 rounds of hollow point defense ammunition. Yes, ma'am, Garrison said, immediately moving to the register. I'll process the background check myself, and the total is on the house. Store policy for 166 SOAR veterans. Beatrice frowned, a stern look crossing her features. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a well-worn leather wallet. Garrison Ridge, I will not take charity from a man I had to drag out of a sandbox, Beatrice said firmly, though there was a hint of warmth in her voice. You have a business to run. Ring it up at full price or I'll go buy it down at the big box store. Garrison smiled, a genuine wide grin that reached his eyes. Yes, Major. Employee discount, then. That's non-negotiable. Acceptable, Beatrice replied. While the digital background check processed through the federal system, Garrison pulled 2 tall stools to the end of the counter. He gestured for Beatrice to sit, and he sat beside her. They did not talk like a shop owner and a customer. They spoke in the low, quiet tones of 2 combat veterans who shared a history, a language, and a profound understanding of the world that the priests sweeping the floors behind them would never comprehend. Garrison asked about her life on the ranch. He asked about her husband, Arthur. Beatrice spoke of Arthur the way she always did, with a quiet, enormous dignity. She told Garrison about the garden out back. She told him that Arthur had been the one with the green thumb. He had planned the entire layout. The heavy tomatoes near the wooden fence to catch the afternoon sun, the delicate herbs near the kitchen door, the sprawling zucchini in the far corner because they needed room to grow. Since he passed, Beatrice said, her voice dropping slightly, her eyes staring at the grain of the wood counter. I've kept the tomatoes going, and the herbs, the rest of the beds. I just haven't had the time to manage them alone. The soil gets hard out there very quickly without water. Garrison listened. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her he was sorry for her loss because he knew grief wasn't something that could be fixed with apologies. He didn't try to offer solutions. He simply sat beside her and listened, honoring her words, which was exactly the right and only thing to do. 15 minutes later, the computer chimed. The paperwork had cleared. Garrison packed the firearm into its protective case, loaded the heavy boxes of ammunition into a sturdy canvas bag, and picked up the heavy biometric safe. I'll walk you out, Major, Garrison said, stepping out from behind the counter. He carried the heavy gear out the front door, the wind immediately hitting them. He walked Beatrice to her old Ford pickup. He carefully set the case and the safe onto the passenger seat, ensuring they wouldn't slide around on the vinyl. Beatrice climbed into the driver's seat. She rolled the window down, the cold wind whipping her silver hair around her face. Garrison stepped up to the door, resting his heavy forearms on the windowsill. He looked at her, his expression entirely serious. Major, Garrison said, his voice low and firm, you mentioned the break-ins out your way. You said they were hitting isolated places. They are, Beatrice confirmed, putting the key into the ignition. Listen to Mawardi, Garrison said, leaning in closer. If you see a vehicle you don't recognize, if you hear a sound on your porch, if you ever need anything at all, you call this shop. You don't wait for the county sheriff. You call me. I will have men at your front door with long rifles in under 20 minutes. Understood. Beatrice looked at the hardened ranger. She saw the fierce loyalty burning in his eyes. It was the bond of the battlefield, a bond that time and distance could never erode. She reached out and briefly squeezed his thick forearm. I understand, Garrison, Beatrice said softly. Thank you. She turned the key. The massive V8 engine roared to life. She shifted the truck into gear. Before she pulled away, she looked back at Garrison. She glanced over his shoulder toward the large glass window of the shop. Inside, she could see Brody Wyatt and Hayes standing near the register, watching them with wide, terrified eyes. Sergeant Ridge, Beatrice said, her voice carrying over the rumble of the engine. Yes, ma'am. The way a man treats the people he believes can do absolutely nothing for him. Beatrice said, her pale blue eyes piercing his. That is exactly who that man really is. Garrison nodded, slowly absorbing the weight of the words. I will make sure they learn that lesson today, ma'am. I promise you that. Beatrice offered a final brief nod. She took her foot off the brake, the old Ford pulling smoothly out of the gravel lot, its tires crunching heavily before hitting the blacktop. Garrison Ridge stood in the parking lot, the cold wind biting through his shirt. He stood at the edge of the asphalt and watched the truck drive away, not moving a muscle until the faded blue tailgate completely disappeared around the distant bend of the highway. Then he turned around. The look on Garrison Ridge's face as he walked back toward the glass doors of Lone Star Munitions was terrifying. It was the look of an apex predator that had just located its prey. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and locked the front door behind him. He flipped the glowing neon open sign to closed, right in the middle of the afternoon. He walked to the center of the showroom floor, his boots echoing like gunshots. He looked at Brody Wyatt and Hayes. They were frozen in place. Lock the registers, Garrison ordered, his voice dangerously calm. Get chairs. Bring them to the center of the room. We are going to have a very long conversation about respect. Little did Garrison know the lesson he was about to teach his employees would be nothing compared to the lesson Beatrice Alden was preparing to teach the men who were currently watching her isolated ranch from the tree line. The heavy steel door of Lone Star Munitions slammed shut, the deadbolt engaging with a loud final click that echoed through the empty showroom. Garrison Ridge stood by the entrance, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. He turned his back to the reinforced glass, shutting out the fading Texas afternoon, and locked his eyes on his three employees. Brody Wyatt and Hayes were already dragging metal folding chairs to the center of the polished concrete floor. They moved in absolute silence. The bravado that had infected them all morning was completely gone, evaporated by the crushing reality of what they had just done. They sat down in a tight semicircle. They kept their hands in their laps. They stared at the floor. Garrison did not sit. He paced. He walked the length of the glass display counters, his heavy boots striking the concrete with a rhythmic, intimidating cadence. For 10 minutes, Garrison Ridge dismantled their egos piece by piece. He did not yell. Yelling was for people who had lost control. Garrison spoke in a low, vibrating baritone that penetrated straight to the bone. He told them what it actually meant to wear a uniform. He stripped away their tactical jargon and their internet-taught combat theories. He told them about the smell of burning diesel and copper blood in the streets of Mogadishu. He told them about men who cried for their mothers in the dirt. And then he told them about Major Beatrice Alden. He described the sheer incomprehensible mechanics of flying a 40,000-pound Black Hawk helicopter into a city that was actively trying to tear it out of the sky. He explained the physical toll of holding a cyclic control stick steady while an anti-aircraft round tore through the fuselage. He painted a picture of a woman who had bled out in a cockpit so that an 18-year-old kid named Garrison could live to see his 19th birthday. As Garrison spoke, the color drained entirely from Hayes's face. The youngest employee was not just listening to the lecture, he was drowning in a sudden sickening wave of realization. His breathing turned shallow. His stomach twisted into a violent knot. His eyes darted toward the cash register, then toward the front door, his mind racing backward in time to earlier that week. Tuesday morning, it had been raining. A man had walked into the shop. He wasn't a regular. He wore a clean Carhartt jacket and spoke with a smooth, easy cadence. He had bought a high-lumen tactical flashlight and a pair of bolt cutters. The man had leaned against the counter right where Beatrice had stood and started making casual conversation about the recent string of burglaries in the county. Hayes had wanted to sound knowledgeable. He had wanted to sound like a local insider, a guy who had his finger on the pulse of the county. The man had asked if the rural properties were mostly armed. Hayes had laughed. He remembered laughing. He remembered leaning over the counter and saying that most of the old folks out on the ridge were practically defenseless. He remembered specifically mentioning the old Alden place at the end of County Road 9. He had said that Arthur Alden had died a few years back, leaving his widow all alone in that big farmhouse. He had said she was a sweet old lady who probably didn't even know how to load a shotgun. He had given a predator a map to the prey. Hayes suddenly gasped, his hands gripping his knees tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The sound was sharp, cutting through Garrison's low voice. Garrison stopped pacing. He turned his heavy gaze toward the 21-year-old. "You have something to add, Hayes?" Garrison asked, his voice cold and flat. Hayes looked up. His eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears of absolute panic. His chest was heaving. He opened his mouth, but his throat was completely dry. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Garrison," Hayes whispered, his voice trembling violently. "The man on Tuesday, the guy who bought the heavy bolt cutters. He was asking about the break-ins." Garrison's eyes narrowed instantly. The teacher vanished. The ranger commander returned. "Keep talking." "He asked who lived out on the ridge," Hayes stammered, his words spilling out in a panicked rush. "He asked who was isolated. I wanted to sound like I knew what was going on. I told him. I told him about the Alden place. I told him her husband died. I told him she lived out there all alone at the end of the road." Brody and Wyatt slowly turned their heads to stare at Hayes' absolute horror washing over their faces. Garrison Ridge did not yell. He did not reprimand. He took one long, terrifyingly slow breath in through his nose. The air in the room seemed to freeze. "Brody," Garrison commanded, his voice suddenly sharp as breaking glass. "Open the heavy safe in the back. Grab the Daniel Defense rifles." Wyatt grabbed the plate carriers and 3 spare magazines for each. Hayes called the county sheriff dispatch directly. "Give them Major Alden's address. Tell them there is an imminent threat to life at that location." Garrison was already moving behind the counter, reaching for his own holstered sidearm, checking the chamber with a brutal, mechanical efficiency. "Move!" Garrison barked. The 3 boys scrambled, the chairs clattering to the floor. They were no longer playing dress-up. The war had just come to their doorstep, and they were the ones who had invited it in. 30 miles away, at the very end of County Road 9, the Texas sky was turning the color of bruised iron. The wind was picking up, howling across the flat plains, bending the dry scrub brush almost flat against the earth. It was the kind of wind that masked the sound of approaching tires. It was the kind of night that swallowed light whole. Beatrice Alden sat at her heavy oak dining table. The only light in the room came from a small brass reading lamp casting a warm yellow circle on the wood. Spread out before her, resting on a clean white microfiber cloth, was the Sig Sauer 365XL. She had not just brought the weapon home and shoved it into a drawer. That was civilian behavior. A weapon was a tool, and a tool required absolute familiarity. Beatrice was systematically stripping the pistol down to its component parts. She moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Slide barrel recoil spring assembly frame. She wiped off the factory shipping grease with a solvent-soaked patch. She applied a microscopic drop of high-viscosity gun oil to the slide rails. Her calloused hands moved over the steel and polymer with the affection and respect of a master craftsman. She understood the engineering. She understood the tolerances. She reassembled the weapon, racking the slide 3 times to ensure the oil was evenly distributed. The metallic clack-clack of the action was crisp, clean, and violently efficient. She picked up the 2 steel magazines. She began loading the hollow point defensive rounds. Press, slide, click. Press, slide, click. She felt the weight of the brass and lead seating perfectly against the follower. She did not look at Hayes Swans while she loaded. Her eyes were fixed on the large window overlooking the front driveway. She watched the shadows lengthen and emerge into complete darkness. Once the magazines were loaded to capacity, she walked into her bedroom. She knelt beside her heavy wooden nightstand. She placed the dark gray biometric lockbox on the floorboards, sliding it perfectly flush against the baseboard, where her hand would naturally fall if she reached down in the dark. She programmed the scanner. She pressed her scarred right index finger against the glowing green pad. It beeped softly. She pressed her thumb. Another beep. She tested it. She closed the lid, waited 3 seconds, and tapped the pad. The heavy steel lid sprang open instantly, completely silent on its dampened hinges. She placed the loaded pistol inside, resting it on the molded foam, ensuring the grip angle was perfectly oriented for a rapid draw. She closed the lid. It locked with a heavy, satisfying thud. Beatrice stood up. She walked back to the kitchen, filled an old iron kettle with water, and placed it on the gas stove. She struck a match, the sulfur smelling sharp in the air, and lit the burner. She stood by the stove, waiting for the water to boil, listening to the wind tear at the shingles on the roof. It was 2100 hours. The house was a fortress of solitude. And then the quiet hum of the refrigerator simply stopped. The digital clock on the microwave went black. The brass reading lamp in the dining room blinked out. The only light left in the entire house was the blue ring of the gas flame under the kettle. Beatrice did not gasp. She did not freeze. Her heart rate did not spike. Her military conditioning, buried under decades of civilian life, instantly seized control of her nervous system. Adrenaline flooded her veins, but it was not the chaotic, paralyzing adrenaline of a victim. It was the cold, highly focused chemical cocktail of a predator. A power outage on a windy night in West Texas was common. But a power outage that occurred exactly at 2100 hours, completely isolating a target property, was a tactical maneuver. Beatrice reached out and calmly turned the knob on the stove, killing the gas flame. The house plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. She closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds, forcing her pupils to dilate rapidly, adjusting to the ambient light filtering in through the windows from the overcast night sky. She moved. She did not rush. She did not stomp her heavy boots. She glided across the hardwood floors with the silent, rolling step of an infantryman in a hostile jungle. She knew every creaking floorboard in this house. She knew every shadow. She knew the exact distance from the kitchen to the hallway, from the hallway to the bedroom. She reached her bedroom. She dropped to one knee beside the nightstand. Her hand brushed the floorboards, finding the cold steel of the biometric safe. Her index finger found the scanner. The pad glowed a faint, ghostly green for a fraction of a second. The lid sprang open silently. Beatrice's hand closed around the textured grip of the Sig Sauer. She lifted it from the foam. She pressed the magazine release slightly, verifying it was seated, and gently pressed the slide forward to ensure it was completely in battery. She was armed. The first rule of defensive combat in a structure is never to hunt the enemy. Moving through a dark house to find an intruder is how you get flanked. You let the enemy come to you. You force them into a fatal funnel, a narrow point where their numbers mean nothing and your line of fire is absolute. Beatrice moved out of the bedroom and stepped into the main hallway. The hallway was long, narrow, and devoid of cover. At the far end was the front door. To her left was the kitchen entrance. To her right was the heavy oak door leading to the rear mudroom. She positioned herself at the deep end of the hallway, kneeling in the pitch-black shadow cast by a heavy antique armoire. She had a perfect, unobstructed view of both the front door and the rear mudroom entrance. She brought the pistol to a low ready, her thumb resting gently on the frame safety. She slowed her breathing, in, out, in, out. She became a part of the house. 2 minutes passed. The wind howled outside. Then she heard it. It was incredibly faint, masked brilliantly by the sound of the wind, but her ears were tuned for the anomaly. It was the metallic scrape of hardened steel sliding against brass. Someone was working a lockpick or a tension wrench into the deadbolt of the rear mudroom door. They were good. They were fast. 10 seconds later, the lock clicked. The heavy oak door swung open with a soft groan of hinges. 3 figures stepped into the mudroom. They were dressed entirely in black. They wore heavy, dark hoodies pulled tight around their faces and thick leather gloves. They moved with the confident, arrogant swagger of men who had done this a dozen times before without ever meeting resistance. They believed they were walking into the home of a terrified, helpless widow. They believed they owned the night. The lead figure raised a heavy, high-powered maglite, preparing to click it on and sweep the kitchen. Beatrice did not wait for them to illuminate her position. She owned the initiative. From the pitch-black shadows at the end of the hallway, Beatrice spoke. She did not yell for help. She did not ask them what they wanted. She projected her voice from her diaphragm, channeling the exact authoritative, bone-rattling tone she used to command flight crews over the deafening roar of twin turbines. It was the voice of God. Do not turn on that light. Do not take another step. The 3 men froze instantly. The voice echoing down the hallway was not the trembling, panicked sound of an elderly woman. It was cold. It was hard. It sounded like a steel blade scraping against stone. It sounded like command. The lead intruder hesitated. That hesitation was his first mistake. His second mistake was deciding to call her bluff. "Shut up, old lady," the lead intruder hissed, his voice laced with forced bravado. He raised his arm, his thumb hovering over the switch of his heavy flashlight, stepping out of the mudroom and into the fatal funnel of the hallway. Beatrice brought the Sig Sauer up to eye level. She did not aim for center mass. She was not a murderer. She was a master of control. She aimed 2 inches to the left of the lead man's head, directly into the heavy wood paneling of the wall. She squeezed the trigger. The 9mm hollow point round detonated with a concussive, deafening roar in the confined space of the hallway. A massive, blinding tongue of orange flame erupted from the muzzle, instantly destroying the intruder's night vision. The bullet smashed into the wood paneling right beside the lead man's ear, showering him in sharp, stinging splinters. The sound was apocalyptic. The shockwave hit the intruders in the chest. The lead man screamed in sheer terror, dropping his heavy flashlight. It hit the floor, rolling wildly, the beam casting chaotic, spinning shadows across the walls. The other 2 men scrambled backward, tripping over each other in the dark, their confidence shattered into a million pieces by the sudden, extreme violence of action. "Drop to the floor," Beatrice roared, her voice booming through the ringing silence following the gunshot. "Face down, hands behind your heads now." The lead man, his ears ringing, his face bleeding from wood splinters, dropped to his knees, throwing his hands over his head. But the second man, younger and fueled by panicked adrenaline, made the worst decision of his life. He pulled a heavy steel crowbar from his belt, letting out a guttural yell, and charged blindly down the dark hallway toward the muzzle flash. He expected to find a frightened woman cowering in the dark. Instead, Beatrice stepped smoothly out from behind the armoire. She did not retreat. She advanced. As the man lunged forward, swinging the heavy crowbar in a wild, sweeping arc, Beatrice sidestepped with the fluid grace of a dancer. She allowed his own momentum to carry him past her. She brought the heavy polymer frame of her pistol down in a brutal, calculated strike against the radial nerve of his swinging arm. The man let out a sharp cry of pain. His fingers went numb. The crowbar clattered harmlessly to the floor. Before he could recover, Beatrice pivoted on her heel. She drove her heavy leather work boot directly into the back of his knee joint. The man's leg buckled instantly. He crashed face first onto the hardwood floor with a sickening thud, the wind completely knocked out of his lungs. Beatrice stepped over him. She planted the heel of her boot firmly against the base of his neck, pinning him to the floor with all of her weight. She kept her posture perfectly upright. The pistol locked in her right hand, the tritium night sights glowing brightly in the dark, aimed directly at the chest of the third man, still standing in the mudroom. "You," Beatrice said, her voice dropping back to that terrifying, calm whisper. "On the ground, next to your friend, or the next round goes through your femur." The third man looked at the glowing green dots aimed at his chest. He looked at his partner, pinned to the floor by a woman twice his age. He looked at the lead man cowering with his hands over his head. He slowly sank to his knees, intertwining his fingers behind his head, pressing his face into the dirt on the floor. Total compliance, absolute psychological dominance. Beatrice did not move. She kept her boot on the struggling man's neck. She kept the weapon raised. Her breathing was perfectly controlled. Her hands were as steady as carved stone. She had secured the objective. Now she simply had to hold the perimeter. 5 minutes passed in the dark. The only sound was the heavy panic breathing of the three intruders on the floor and the relentless howling of the Texas wind outside. Then the darkness was shattered. Brilliant, blinding white light flooded through the front windows of the farmhouse. The heavy, roaring sound of a massive diesel engine tore up the gravel driveway. Garrison Ridge had arrived. He didn't knock. He didn't wait for the police. Garrison kicked the heavy front door open with a force that splintered the doorframe. He surged into the house, a massive, terrifying silhouette against the headlights of his truck. He was wearing a plate carrier over his flannel shirt, holding a short-barreled Daniel Defense AR-15, locked tight into his shoulder, the tactical light mounted on the rail slicing through the darkness of the hallway. Behind him, Brody Wyatt and Hayes spilled into the room, armed, terrified, and desperate. Garrison's tactical light swept the hallway. The beam illuminated the wood splinters on the wall. It illuminated the crowbar on the floor. And then the beam locked onto Beatrice Alden. She was standing tall in the center of the hallway. Her silver hair was glowing in the harsh light. Her boot was planted firmly on the neck of a weeping intruder. Her Sig Sauer was held at a perfect low ready. She looked entirely unharmed, entirely unfazed, and utterly terrifying. Garrison lowered the barrel of his rifle. He stared at the scene before him, his chest heaving. He looked at the three defeated men on the floor. He looked at the major. Beatrice turned her head, slightly squinting against the glare of his weapon light. "You're late, Sergeant Ridge," Beatrice said dryly, a faint trace of amusement in her voice. Garrison let out a long, heavy breath that sounded halfway between a laugh and a sigh of absolute relief. He clicked off his tactical light and slung his rifle over his back. He reached down and grabbed the lead intruder by the collar of his hoodie, hauling him off the floor with one massive hand like he was picking up a stray dog. "My apologies, Major," Garrison said, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his hardened face. Traffic was murder on the interstate. Behind him, Brody and Wyatt stared at Beatrice with their mouths hanging slightly open. The image of the frail, elderly woman they had mocked that morning had been entirely obliterated, replaced by the towering reality of a combat veteran who had just single-handedly dismantled a home invasion crew in complete darkness. Hayes stood near the doorway, his hands trembling as he lowered his shotgun. He looked at Beatrice, then looked down at his boots, the crushing weight of his guilt warring with the immense relief that she was alive. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 county sheriff cruisers painted the front of the farmhouse. Deputies swarmed the property, hauling the 3 intruders out in heavy steel handcuffs. The paramedics checked on Beatrice, but she waved them off with a stern look, refusing even to sit down while she gave her statement to the lead detective. Garrison stood by his truck, watching her command the attention of the law enforcement officers. He felt a deep, profound sense of pride. The world might have moved on. The world might have decided that people like Beatrice were obsolete, but Garrison knew the truth. Wolves were always wolves, no matter how much gray was in their fur. The week passed. The story of the widow who took down the county burglary ring spread through the town like wildfire. Saturday morning arrived. The sky over West Texas was wide blue and painfully clear. The wind was gentle, carrying the smell of dry earth and sagebrush. Beatrice walked out onto her back porch holding a mug of black coffee. She looked out over the sprawling, empty beds of Arthur's garden. The soil was cracked and dry. Weeds were choking the wooden fence lines. It was a monumental task for one person. She took a sip of her coffee. Then she heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. She walked around to the front of the house. A small, beaten-up sedan was parked near the barn. The driver's side door opened and Hayes stepped out. He was not wearing his tactical gear from the gun shop. He was wearing heavy denim jeans, scuffed work boots, and a plain gray t-shirt. He looked smaller today. He looked incredibly nervous. He walked slowly toward the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps, taking off his baseball cap and holding it tightly in both hands. He looked up at Beatrice. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his voice quiet and respectful. Beatrice looked down at him. She did not smile, but her eyes were not unkind. "Hayes, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Hayes swallowed hard. He looked at the ground, then forced himself to look her directly in the eyes. "I'm not here to apologize to you, Major," Hayes said, his voice trembling slightly but holding steady. "Garrison told me that apologies don't fix broken fences. Action does." He gestured toward the trunk of his car. "I brought a post hole digger, a shovel, and 2 bags of soil amendment." Hayes continued, standing up a little straighter. "I know Mr. Alden used to keep a beautiful garden out back. I know the soil is hard. I was hoping, I was hoping you would let me help you turn the dirt today. Beatrice looked at the young man. She saw the guilt in his eyes, but more importantly, she saw the genuine, desperate desire to make things right. He wasn't running from his mistake. He was standing on her property, offering his sweat to pay his debt. It was the first step on the long road from being a boy to becoming a man. Beatrice Alden took a slow sip of her black coffee. She looked at the blue Texas sky. Then she looked back down at Hayes. The tomatoes go near the western fence line, Hayes, Beatrice said quietly. They need the afternoon sun. The tools are in the shed. I expect the rows to be perfectly straight. A massive wave of relief washed over Hayes's face. He nodded vigorously, placing his cap back on his head. Yes, ma'am, perfectly straight. He turned and practically jogged toward his car to retrieve his tools. Beatrice watched him go, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. The ranch was quiet, but it didn't feel quite as empty anymore. 30 miles away, back at Lone Star Munitions, the Saturday morning crowd was beginning to file in. The shop was busy, the cash registers ringing. Garrison Ridge stood behind the main counter. He was watching Brody and Wyatt interact with the customers. The boys were different today. They were speaking quietly. They were asking questions. They were listening intently to the older men who walked through the doors, treating every single customer with a profound, careful respect. The arrogance was gone. Garrison reached beneath the counter. He pulled out a large, heavy sign made of dark-stained oak. He had spent the previous evening carving the letters deeply into the wood with a router. He walked to the front entrance of the shop. He picked up a heavy drill and drove 2 long steel screws through the sign, mounting it directly above the doorframe, right where every single person would see it the moment they crossed the threshold. He stepped back, wiping the sawdust from his hands, and read the words carved into the wood. Every person who walks through this door has a story you don't know. Treat them accordingly. Garrison nodded to himself. He turned his back to the door and walked back to the counter, ready to run his shop. The lesson had been learned. The perimeter was secure, and out on the edge of the Texas plains, the Major was finally tending to her garden.